Hi, today I'm going to read Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. As you might well expect, everybody who lives in Happyland is as happy as the day is long. Whenever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to be happy in Happyland. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happyland are happy as well. And if you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happyland. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake, at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happyland. One day, Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in the woods near his home, and he came across something that was really rather extraordinary. There in the trunk of one of the very tall trees was a door. Not a very large door, but nonetheless certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of the small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open very easily. Just inside the narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked round and saw there in front of him another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice, a sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked just like him, except he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you indeed?" sniffed the voice. Sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy, but he wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the whole world." "Why are you miserable?" said Mr. Happy. "Because I am," said Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable, "but I'm so miserable I don't think I could ever be happy." Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Ah, don't argue, Mr. Happy," and he went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then he followed, up and up the winding staircase. They went up and round and up and round and round and up until they came out into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time. And during that time, the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable ever so slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners. And ever so slowly, it started to turn up. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life. He smiled. And then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everyone started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of someone called Mr. Miserable who couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners, go on and smile. Thank you for listening. Bye.